Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Illicit: How Smugglers, Traffickers, and Copycats Are Hijacking the Global Economy, by Moisés Naím. Narrated by Heitsch. Chapter 1. The Wars We Are Losing. The famous former United States President, for 8 years the most powerful man on earth, was born in a small country town blessed with very good feng shui. As an adolescent, struggling to excel in spite of his modest rural circumstances, he admired the ambition of Gu Yanwu, who said we should walk 10,000 miles and read 10,000 books. Often during his political career, he sought wisdom and guidance in the sayings of Chairman Mao. As for the starstruck young intern with whom he had an affair that nearly destroyed his presidency, he had this to say: she was very fat. The Chinese version of Bill Clinton's autobiography, My Life, that hit the streets in July 2004, months before the official licensed translation, was obviously a grotesque forgery. Its appearance served as a welcome of sorts, introducing the former president to one of the more dubious honors of modern writerly fame. In Colombia, for instance, an entire cottage industry specializes in unlicensed copies of the works of the country's great novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. In 2004, a master copy of the Nobel Prize winner's first novel in 10 years vanished without a trace from the printing press. Days later, a pirate edition could be found on Bogotá's sidewalks, its text accurate but for the final revisions that Garcia Marquez, a perfectionist, had been waiting until the last moment to turn in. Laughable as they may seem, little separates these scams from others with far more dire consequences. The same knockoff markets not only sell bootleg books and DVDs, but pirated Microsoft and Adobe software. Not only faux Gucci and Chanel accessories, but bogus brand-name machinery made with substandard parts that can cause industrial accidents. Not only placebo Viagra for gullible mail-order shoppers, but also expired or adulterated medicines that don't cure but kill. In defiance of regulations and taxes, treaties and laws, virtually anything of value is offered for sale in today's global marketplace, including illegal drugs, endangered species, human chattel for sex slavery and sweatshops, human cadavers and live organs for transplant, machine guns and rocket launchers, and centrifuges and precursor chemicals used in nuclear weapons development. This trade is illicit trade. It is trade that breaks the rules, the laws, regulations, licenses, taxes, embargoes, and all the procedures that nations employ to organize commerce, protect their citizens, raise revenues, and enforce moral codes. It includes purchases and sales that are strictly illegal everywhere, and others that may be illegal in some countries and accepted in others. Illicit trade is highly disruptive, of course, to legitimate businesses, except when it isn't. For as we shall hear, this is an enormous gray area between legal and illegal transactions, a gray area that the illicit traders have turned to great advantage. The marketing and distribution channels that transport all this contraband, and the financial circuits that move the hundreds of billions of dollars that it generates every year, aren't exactly hidden from view. Some of the physical marketplaces can even be looked up in tourist guides to the world's great cities: Silk Alley in Beijing, Chaorankrung Road in Bangkok, Canal Street in New York City. Others, like the arms and drugs bazaar town of Dara Adam Khel in northwest Pakistan, or the multi-product trafficking and money laundering center of Ciudad del Este in Paraguay, serving the Argentine and Brazilian markets, aren't exactly leisure spots, but are no less widely known. Factories in the Philippines or China that produce licensed manufactured goods may run unauthorized second shifts with shoddy components. Shipments of methamphetamine and bootleg videos and night vision military goggles often travel in the same containers and cargo holds as loads of semiconductors and frozen fish and grapefruit. The proceeds of illicit trade merge with the greatest of ease into the vast daily flow of interbank settlements and Western Union money transfers. And the Internet not only boosts the speed and efficiency of all these trades, but expands the possibilities by, for instance, hosting online markets for prostitutes from Moldova and Ukraine, destined for shipment to markets in Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the United States. Neither are those who benefit from illicit trade always careful to hide in the shadows. Many exercise their trade in the open, daring authorities to crack down on them, or inviting them to collude. In Thailand, a massage parlor operator ran for public office in 2003 on a platform of criticizing the police, in effect running to defend his own interests in the trade in human beings while tapping into broader public discontent. In neighboring Cambodia, the national police are partnered with international watchdogs in cracking down on the traffic in children for sex, but the local units collect payment envelopes from known traffickers in full public view. Illicit traders may have forsaken grand, hubristic gestures. Pablo Escobar Gaviria, the famed drug kingpin, in his heyday, offered to pay up Colombia's entire national debt, but they have grown sophisticated in forming front companies with complex financial structures spanning numerous countries, blurring their traces so well that they can safely operate in the open. Which means that not only is illicit trade on the rise, but its interplay with social crisis, conflict, corruption, exploitation, is more complex than it has been since the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. 3 illusions. Yet, in the face of all the evidence, at least 3 grand illusions persist in the way we, the public and the politicians in whom we place our trust, address global illicit trade. First is the illusion that there is nothing new. Illicit trade is age-old, a continuous facet and side effect of market economies, or of commerce in general. Illicit trade's ancestor, smuggling, traces back to ancient times, and many a thieves' market survives in the world's commercial hubs. Therefore, skeptics would argue that since smuggling has always been more a nuisance than a scourge, it is a threat we can learn to live with as we have always done. But this skepticism ignores the important transformations of the 1990s. Changes in political and economic life, along with revolutionary technologies in the hands of civilians, have dissolved the sealants that governments traditionally relied on to secure their national borders. At the same time, the market-oriented economic reforms that swept the world in the 1990s boosted incentives to break through these sealants, legally or otherwise. Not only did the hold of governments on borders weaken, but the reforms amplified the rewards awaiting those who were prepared to break the rules. Technology enlarged the market, not just geographically, by lowering transport costs, but also by making possible the trade in a whole range of goods that didn't exist before, such as pirated software or genetically modified marijuana. New technologies also made it possible to trade internationally products that, in the past, were hard or impossible to transport or hold in inventory. Human kidneys, for instance. Markets, of course, were also enlarged when governments deregulated previously closed or tightly controlled economies and allowed foreigners to visit, trade, and invest more freely. The massive transfer of goods and equipment once under the exclusive control of national armies into private hands released into the market products ranging from rocket launchers to Scud missiles and nuclear designs and machinery. Moreover, governments also boosted illicit trade by criminalizing new activities. File sharing through the Internet, for example, is a newly illegal activity that has added millions to the ranks of illicit traders. A clue to the explosion of illicit trade is the relentless rise of money laundering. Eventually, every illicit line of business generates money that needs to be laundered, and there is ample evidence that despite all the precautions and enforcement measures now in place, there is more and more dirty money floating in the international financial system now than ever before. Yet, until now, with the exception of narcotics, illicit trade has simply not been a priority in international law and treaty-making, or in international police work and cooperative law enforcement. The United Nations devised common language to describe it only in the year 2000, and most countries have a long way to go in adapting their laws to international standards, let alone enforcing them. It took the advent of software piracy and the birth of intellectual property crime to add a fillip to international efforts against counterfeiting. And trafficking in persons, the most morally outrageous of all the forms of illicit trade, was defined in the 1990s only by academics and activists and made the subject of a specific comprehensive law in the United States in 2000. Only 17 other countries have done the same. The second illusion is that illicit trade is just about crime. It is true that criminal activities surged and became global in the 1990s, but thinking about international illicit trade as just another manifestation of criminal behavior misses a larger, more consequential point. Global criminal activities are transforming the international system, upending the rules, creating new players, and reconfiguring power in international politics and economics. The United States attacked Iraq because it feared that Saddam Hussein had acquired weapons of mass destruction. But during the same time, a stealthy network led by A.Q. Khan, a Pakistani engineer, was profiting by selling nuclear bomb-making technology to whoever could pay for it. Throughout the 20th century, to the extent that governments paid attention to illicit trade at all, they framed it, to their public and to themselves, as the work of criminal organizations. Consciously or not, investigators around the world took the model of the American and Sicilian mafia as their blueprint. Propelled by this mindset, the search for traffickers, almost always in drugs, led to what investigators thought could be only corporate-like organizations, structured, disciplined, and hierarchical. The Colombian cartels, Chinese tongs, Hong Kong triads, Japanese yakuza, and eventually, after 1989, the Russian mafia, were all approached this way. First, as criminal organizations, only later as traders. In most countries, the laws employed to prosecute illicit traders remain those born of the fight against organized crime, like the Racketeering and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, statutes in the United States. Only recently has this mindset begun to shift. Thanks to Al-Qaeda, the world now knows what a network of highly motivated individuals owing allegiance to no nation and empowered by globalization can do. The problem is that the world still thinks of these networks mostly in terms of terrorism. Yet, as the book ahead shows, profit can be as powerful a motivator as God. Networks of stateless traders in illicit goods are changing the world as much as terrorists are, probably more. But a world obsessed with terrorists has not yet taken notice. The third illusion is the idea that illicit trade is an underground phenomenon. Even accepting that trafficking has grown in volume and complexity, many, not least politicians, seek to regulate it to a different world than that of ordinary, honest citizens and constituents. The language we use to describe illicit trade and to frame our efforts to contain it betrays the enduring power of this illusion. The word offshore, as in offshore finance, vividly captures this sense that illicit trade takes place somewhere else. So does black market, or the supposedly clearly distinct clean and dirty money. All signify a clarity, an ability to draw moral and economic lines and patrol their boundaries that is confounded in practice. This is the most dangerous of all these illusions because it treads on moral grounds and arguably lulls citizens, and hence public opinion, into a sense of heightened righteousness and false security. This point is not about moral relativism. A thief is a thief. But how do you describe a woman who manages to provide some material well-being to her destitute family in Albania or Nigeria by entering another country illegally and working the streets as a prostitute or as a peddler of counterfeited goods? What about bankers in Manhattan or London who take home big year-end bonuses as a reward for having stocked their bank's vaults with the deposits of high-net-worth individuals whose only known job has been with a government in another country? Many American high schoolers can procure a joint of marijuana more easily than they can purchase a bottle of vodka or a pack of cigarettes, and they know they don't really run any major risk in doing so. Meanwhile, honest Colombian judges or police officers are routinely gunned down in a war on drugs that the U.S. government funds to the tune of $40 billion a year. These are not just infuriating contradictions, unfair double standards, or interesting paradoxes. They are powerful clues about how age-old human mores have acquired new hues. Elusive and powerful. Since the early 1990s, global illicit trade has embarked on a great mutation. It is the same mutation as that of international terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or Islamic Jihad, or, for that matter, of activists for the global good like the environmental movement or the World Social Forum. All have moved away from fixed hierarchies and toward decentralized networks, away from controlling leaders and toward multiple, loosely linked, dispersed agents and cells, away from rigid lines of control and exchange and toward constantly shifting transactions as opportunities dictate. It is a mutation that governments in the 1990s barely recognized and could not, in any case, hope to emulate. The world's first unmistakable glimpse of this transformation came on September 11, 2001. Politicians would later say that on that day, the world changed. It might be more apt to say that on that day, something about the world was revealed. At the very least, the incredible power now residing in the hands of an entirely new kind of international entity, inherently stateless and deeply elusive. As subsequent events demonstrated, even experts disagreed as to what they were observing and what it might have to do with specific states and regimes. Left unchecked, illicit trade can only pursue its already well-advanced mutation. There is ample evidence that it offers terrorists and other miscreants means of survival and methods of financial transfer and exchange. Its effect on geopolitics will go further. In developing countries, and those in transition from communism, criminal networks often constitute the most powerful vested interests confronting the government. In some countries, their resources and capabilities even surpass those of their governments. These capabilities often translate into political clout. Traffickers and their associates control political parties, own significant media operations, or are the major philanthropists behind non-governmental organizations. This is a natural outcome in countries where no economic activity can match illicit trade in size or profits, and therefore traffickers become the nation's big business. And once their business becomes large and stable, trafficking networks do as big businesses are prone to do everywhere else: diversify into other businesses and invest in politics. After all, gaining access and influence and seeking government protection has always been part and parcel of big business. Therefore, not only are illicit networks tightly intertwined with licit private sector activities, but they are also deeply embedded within the public sector and the political system. And once they have spread into licit private corporations, political parties, parliaments, local governments, media groups, the courts, the military, and the non-profit sector, trafficking networks assume a powerful, and in some countries unrivaled, influence on matters of state. Perversely, the awareness of the ravaging effects of illicit trade often sparks nationalistic impulses and insular responses. Ironically, these reactions end up working in favor of the traffickers, for the more states seek to raise barriers against the flow of illicit goods, services, and labor, the more the traffickers stand to profit from their trade. National borders are a boon to criminals and a block to law enforcement agencies. Borders create profit opportunities for smuggling networks and weaken nation-states by limiting their ability to curb the onslaughts of the global networks that hurt their economies, corrupt their politics, and undermine their institutions. This story is no longer just about crime. It is also about a new form of politics in the 21st century, and about the new economic realities that have brought to the fore a whole new set of political actors whose values may collide with yours and mine, and whose intentions threaten us all. Blind spots. My interest in illicit trade comes out of a decade of work on the surprises of globalization. As editor of Foreign Policy magazine, it has been my job to track and understand the unanticipated consequences of the new connections between world politics and economics. As I encountered these surprises, learned the stories, and often had the chance to meet their protagonists, this professional interest evolved into a personal fascination. I wrote about financial crashes on one continent that rock countries oceans away, and on the ways in which new standards of human rights developed in Europe ended up transforming politics in Latin America. I studied how corruption became a political lightning rod more or less simultaneously around the world, and not because corruption was born in the 1990s. What surprised me the most, however, was how often my research on a host of seemingly unrelated topics led me to the world of illicit trade and global crime. My background is not in law enforcement or criminology, but as I investigated the effects of globalization on international economics, finance, and government, in rich and poor countries alike, I was inexorably pushed toward this topic. Travels in Russia, China, Eastern Europe, and Latin America convinced me that there was much going on in those regions and in the world that we could never understand unless we paid more attention to the role of criminal activities in shaping decisions, institutions, and outcomes. My work at Foreign Policy also gave me a privileged and panoramic window into the changes the world was experiencing, and the chance to discuss with some of the world's more insightful analysts and practitioners how they were interpreting these changes. I also made a habit, however, of devoting some time everywhere I went to seek out police officers, prosecutors, journalists, and academics who could give me a glimpse of the illicit trade situation in their country. It quickly became clear that even in countries as diverse as Thailand, Colombia, Greece, Mexico, and China, these conversations had an uncanny resemblance. Illicit trade was bigger, more pervasive, and less understood than most people realized, including me. Up close, its political consequences were evident and frightening. Yet their discussion was, at best, marginal. The more I looked, the more I found specialists who knew a lot about one aspect of global crime and far less about the others or the ties that connect them. I began to assemble my own list of perplexities, anecdotes, data, sources, thinkers, practitioners, and surprises about the different illicit markets. I soon discovered that it was impossible to read the newspaper on any day, anywhere in the world, without spotting news about illicit trade. Most of the time it was presented as different stories, but for me, these news items had become manifestations of a single, unified global phenomenon, driven by the same improbable combination of old human impulses, new technologies, and changed politics. It also became apparent to me that neither reporters nor academics were affording the political consequences of the events they were writing about the importance that those on the front line of these fights kept telling me they had. I was also intrigued by the scant attention specialists in international relations and world politics were paying to the consequences of illicit trade on their subjects of study. Most of all, I was baffled by how an inherently economic phenomenon was customarily treated with moral denunciations and law enforcement remedies. In early 2002, the American Society of International Law invited me to deliver the annual Grotius Lecture, which I centered on my views on illicit trade. I titled it The 5 Wars of Globalization, referring to the illicit markets for arms, drugs, human beings, intellectual property, and money, and it was published in slightly different versions in the American University International Law Review and the following year in Foreign Policy. The article was reprinted by many other publications and enjoyed a broad dissemination worldwide. The publication of 5 Wars encouraged many scholars, magistrates, and prosecutors, law enforcement and intelligence officers, journalists, and even victims of trafficking from around the world to share their views and experiences with me. Again, I encountered stories from different trades, different countries, different continents, and different contexts. Yet the stories' patterns and even details shared extraordinary similarities. More important, they illuminated even more sharply the prevailing blind spots, both in the analytical lenses we use to make sense of what is going on and in the public policies that governments have chosen to address this problem. These blind spots, too, were uncannily similar. Thus, the idea of this book was born. A note about data. The volumes of the illicit trades and the profits derived from them remain, at best, gross estimates. All the numbers in this book come from the most reliable sources possible, usually international organizations and governments or non-governmental organizations whose work is generally deemed to be serious and reliable. Each of the facts, figures, and events mentioned in the text is referenced at the end of the book. Most of the individuals I interviewed are also named in the references, except, of course, those who would speak only on the condition of anonymity. Still, while the figures used here are the best available, it is important to remember that these are estimates of secret activities. They may, therefore, either underestimate or overestimate the reality. Nonetheless, all the available evidence supports the central empirical argument of the book. The volume of these trades is larger and their operations much more complex and sophisticated today than they were in 1990. And, as the chapters ahead discuss, we are beginning to understand how they really work and what their effects are. Chapter 2. Global Smugglers Are Changing Your World. There is the story we know, and then there is the other story. Here is what we know. The last decade of the 20th century changed the world. A sudden, unexpected eruption of new ideas and new technologies in turn changed politics and economics everywhere. Billions of lives were transformed. The demise of the Soviet Union discredited communism and gave free politics and free markets unprecedented popularity. As a result, the 1990s will go down in history as an example of a period when the power of ideas...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?